We are going to talk about, who we are, what it is we do. I'll do a recap. This is the last session in a series that we've done this spring. And so I know some of you may have attended those sessions. So I won't rehash all of the content, but just want to contextualize it so that it will make clear what we're talking about today regarding the essays. And then obviously we'll dive into the essay process, creating a narrative. What does that mean? How do we specifically do it? And then obviously welcome your questions. So just by way of very brief introduction, and you can see our profiles on our website if you want to know a little bit more about us, but my background is pretty much on the institutional side. I ran admissions at Georgetown for about 10 years for the full-time and part-time program. I also worked in undergrad admissions for about 7 years before that. And then I've been on this side of the desk now for about the past 4.5 years. So the vantage point and the value that I'm really able to bring to the conversation is from the AdCom perspective, the admissions committee perspective. I have managed AdComs for years and years. I probably could figure out a way to calculate the number of essays that I've read over the years, probably tens of thousands at this point. And so having that broad base of knowledge, that's what I am drawing on when I talk about what works, what doesn't work, what are some of the pitfalls we can avoid and help you avoid. And so Brenna, why don't you, briefly overview your background as well so they know who they're hearing from.
Sure. Hi, I'm Bryna Kranzler. I have a BA in writing from Barnard and an MBA from Yale. I bring a writer and storyteller's perspective to working with you on your essays. I'm also the author of a historical biography. In addition, I have the experience of working in the high-tech, healthcare, and consumer products industries, and that helps me understand a lot of the roles you've held. And I have almost 10 years of experience in essay coaching and editing.
And Brenna is one of our fan favorite essay coaches because of her ability to sort of have a foot in each of these worlds that can sometimes seem pretty disparate. So knowing that you have someone who understands the background of the content, but then also the process, obviously as a writer herself, and her book is very good. I've read it. So just a very brief recap, because I do want to focus this session on the essay process, and I know that tends to be the part of the process that clients and applicants feel the most anxious about. The first session, I talked about the admissions process, the overview of the admissions process as both a science and an art. And so the admissions committee is trying to craft a class, right? And you've probably heard some of these terms, but what that means is that they're looking for a lot of different kinds of people. And so, there's no model that AdComs create that then can spit out the class, right? Because if it was just based on the numbers, frankly, that'd be a lot easier. But what we know is that the experience and the process involves a lot more than that. And so that's where you hear that it's a holistic process. And I think that word is overused, and yet I use it all the time. But what I like to do is break that down into two dimensions. The first is the quantitative and the second is the qualitative. And so the quantitative really it's the numbers behind your application. It's the nuts and bolts, right? So your academic experience in undergrad, or if you've had another, graduate school experience, certifications, any credentials beyond that are academic in nature. And then obviously your standardized test scores, not only your cumulative GMAT or GRE score, but the breakdown of your sub-scores. If you're non-native English speaker, then that will also include your TOEFL or your EFL, whatever English test that you take. And so, the numbers are one part and an important part of the process, because the admissions committee is asking the question, is this person academically qualified to be in our program? Are they set up for success? And importantly, when you're in a highly selective candidate pool, like probably most of you are going to be aiming for, the majority of people, of applicants, they fall within those ranges, right? They can sort of tick the box and say, yep, they're academically qualified. And yet, obviously not all of those people are going to receive an offer. And that's really where the second dimension comes into play. And that's where the focus needs to be for many applicants. And that's the qualitative. And I call this sort of the touchy-feely part of the application, right? I mean, it's your story, it's the personal aspects of who you are beyond your numbers. And so that's everything from not only what you've done as represented on your resume, but how you've added value. And that's a really important piece, right? It's what matters to you beyond that. How do you spend your time when you're not at work? Maybe some of you are working 80 or 90 hours a week, but thinking about the things that get your juices flowing, what excites you. The admissions committee is trying to understand, what have you done? What are you hoping to do? Obviously through your goal articulation. And then how is that going to contribute to the community? because part of what they're looking at is not only people that are going to benefit from the MBA. And so that's why through your application, you want to make the case for why the MBA is the right next step for you, but also how you're going to contribute. And so in that way, it's very much a symbiotic relationship. And I think sometimes candidates miss that last piece because they're so focused on making the case for why they're a good fit. And that's extremely important, obviously, why they're a good fit for a particular program. But also that second piece is really important too, about your story, about what you're going to come and contribute. And so that qualitative piece, obviously a huge part of that, I mentioned the resume, but a huge part of that is going to be your essays. And so I think the reason people get a little bit maybe stressed about this is because it's less tangible, right? Like with the GMAT, all right, I'm going in and like, here's my goal. And I need to, hit this, be in this mid 80% range if I want to look at like the M7 schools. But the essay is a lot harder because there is no set template for it. And in fact, I think if you try to follow a template, that isn't necessarily going to yield success, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about, well, then what do I do with that piece, right? And just to round out the qualitative piece, also what other people share about you through recommendations, and then how you show up during an interview. All of that is also part of your story. And so you want to make sure that there's a connection and that there's a through line. And thinking about it in that way will help you craft an essay and then deliver on the other parts of your application so that there's that consistency. I often use the term connect the dots, and you want to make sure that you're connecting the dots through your application process. So one of the ways that we at MBA Link help you start that, before you sit down to write your essays, you're actually going to start with the thinking. And it sounds so obvious, and yet you'd be shocked how many clients come to us. They're like, oh, I just need help with my essays. Like, here's my essay question. Like, maybe they've even drafted something and they just want to dive right into it. And I understand that, right? But it's very clear to me, as someone who's read many essays, I can tell when someone's done the thinking. And that takes time, and it can be really challenging to do. And so we coach people through that process using what we call the FAME framework. And I won't go over it. We did a session on it. So if you're interested, I'm happy to send you the link to that webinar. But we have a very intentional way of coaching you through that thought process with the idea at the end of arriving at, hopefully, the structure, a basic structure for your narrative. And when I say narrative, it's your story, right? There's nothing fancy about it. There's no secret sauce to it, but it is going to be unique and different for everyone. And a lot of times that can be hard to see without a more objective perspective. Some clients will come to me and they're like, well, I don't really feel all that special, right? Like my background's in engineering and I've been a consultant, and, or I'm an engineer and I want to transition into consulting. And that's kind of just a really basic story. And on the surface, it may be, but you'll find through our process that we will help you dig a little bit deeper to figure out, okay, how do I go beyond that? And then how do I package that up to talk about it in a compelling way? So that's just the recap of what we did. And I started to talk a little bit about FAME, but specifically the fit, the abilities, the motivation, and then the experiences. So FAME 4 is experiences, and that really lays the groundwork for your essays. You are going to actually start generating content with your FAME coach that your essay coach will then be able to draw on as a starting point for the work that you do with him or her. And so you can see these themes. Most of them are consistent with the questions that you're going to get from different schools. Obviously, each school has its own essay set, but you're going to need to articulate your goals for all of your schools, right? Most of the schools are going to want to know something along the lines of what these themes will help you draw out. But obviously, you'll need to write the essay to address whatever question they're asking. But this is meant to be a starting point. You'll then, again, start to work with your essay coach. Brian is going to talk about that. And then, obviously, the nuts and bolts behind the drafting process all the way through copy editing. I always feel like I need to say we don't write essays for clients. That seems fairly obvious, but we always like to set the expectation. Our goal is to help you produce the best representation of your writing skills, of your ability to communicate through your written essays. And so I think that having an objective perspective and a team behind you to help you with that will make the process a little bit hopefully less stressful, maybe even enjoyable, because it can really be a fun part of the process. I know it's one of my favorite parts of the application in general, is reading the essays, because that's where people really are able to come to life and come off the page. So I've already talked longer than I said I would. But Bryna, I want to pass it over to you to really dig into the essay writing process, both how we do it at MBA Link, but also some of the more general themes and takeaways that you think would be helpful for them, regardless, maybe, for our attendees, maybe you're not ready to commit to working with a consultant, maybe you're not really sure what that's all about. So we'll talk about that, but also want you to have some concrete takeaways that you can use in your process, regardless of what you choose to do from here. So I'll pass it over to you, Brenda, and you take it from here.
Okay. So Caitlin talked about FAME, and I'm a real fan of FAME. It's not an exercise to make work for you, but it's a tool that guides your introspection. So before I meet with you, I will review your FAME work, particularly the stories you tell in FAME 4, because those help me get to know you, as well as determine if there's a theme that summarizes much of your life and work to date. Now, even if you had planned to go into a certain direction after college, but couldn't get a job in your field of choice and had to do something else, you may be surprised to discover that there is some consistency in what you've done that forms the story of your journey. That's a great way to explain to the admissions committee who you are. And even if there isn't a specific theme, our conversation will guide how you'll tell your story. So let me give you an example. Last year, I worked with one student of the Sikh faith. In our conversation, he explained to me that the tenets of the Sikh religion are learning and serving. Since he was studying computer science, I thought of learning, or what he took in, as input, and serving, or what he put out, as output. That was the framework around which we focused his personal statement, highlighting some key experiences in terms of what he had learned and what he had done with what he had learned. And that offered a natural, one of my many alarms for myself. That offered a natural segue into what he wanted to learn and how he was planning to use the knowledge. So in order for me to be of greatest help to you, I need you to be honest with yourself in your FAME work. Think about what you've done well and not so well, and importantly, why. And that's not to assign blame, but to probe those pivotal experiences that have made you who you are. And that's what allows us to help you put your heart on paper, to let the admissions committee know what otherwise might take them many hours of interviews to find out. And makes them say, this is a person I'd like to know. Now, the way in which you let them know who you are is by showing them the experiences that have developed your personality. Perhaps there was an experience in childhood that had a profound effect on you, an effect that you didn't recognize at the time, but only understand in retrospect. And having a theme makes your essays cohesive and consistent. Yeah. And when I say show, I mean that you're going to tell the story in a way that allows the reader to put himself or herself in your shoes. Use sensory details to describe the experience, and most importantly, share what it felt like at the time. It's also important to be able to articulate what you learned or realized and how you grew from the experience, because that is what we all are, the sum of our experiences.
One thing I just want to add to that, Brenda, that I think is really important, the first point about where you've excelled and where you failed. Oops, I'm just going to go back for a second. All right. I'm sorry. There we go. When it comes to sort of failure, I think it's important to remember that if there's a question, or if there is, something that you're a little unsure about talking about, it's really important to be proactive. They say the best defense is a good offense, because the admissions committee is probably going to see that, and they're going to probably have questions about that. Whether it is, gaps in your resume that you need to fill in through an essay to tell that story. And that's really important, because I think sometimes people I found feel reticent about drawing attention to it. And my point is that the attention is probably already there, because those are the things that the admissions committee is looking out for. And you don't want to leave them guessing. So for example, if you've had 3 job changes in a short period of time, there could be a very real reason why, that made sense. For example, I think I might have shared this anecdote in an earlier session, but one of my clients from this past year had visa issues. And so, because his visa had kept getting transferred and expiring, that was totally beyond his control. So it wasn't that he couldn't hold down a job. And in fact, we were able to think about, oh, actually, the fact that you were able to find another job and another company to sponsor you, that actually shows a lot. That was important to include. But had he been sensitive about it, which he was, honestly, the admissions committee never would have known that. And so things that you perceive as a weakness or a failure, maybe they are, and that's fine. And that's where talking about how you grew from it, what you took away from it, is going to be really important, because those are the skills they're looking for in their MBAs. So I just wanted to emphasize that, because being proactive, especially with the hard stuff, is really important when it comes to your essays. So Brenna, I'll keep going.
Okay. So by the time I meet you, you'll have already done a lot of work with other coaches, and that's going to give me a lot of information and input to review. So in addition to reviewing your resume, I'll also review and make notes on your FAME work, paying attention to comments from other members of the MBA Link team who will point out anything that's particularly important to address in your unique situation. And Caitlin mentioned a couple of examples of situations that need to be addressed. Those are things that are going to be appear in your entire application package, and they shouldn't be ignored. They may have things to do also with a particular program you're applying to, or something in your background that requires explanation. Just so you know, I don't see your transcript, so I rely on the other FAME coaches to let me know if we need to explain something like why your grades fell one semester, or if we need to explain a leave of absence or something else. Based on that, I'll probably have some questions to make sure I understand the situation so we can address it properly. As I mentioned earlier, if your story reveals a theme, we can use that as the basis for telling your story. Otherwise, we'll choose a focal point for your story. We'll talk through how I perceive your story, and I'll ask if you feel I've appropriately understood and described how you see yourself. If not, or if something is missing, we'll talk some more until I have a clear picture of who you are and how you want to present yourself. Then we'll review the individual essay questions, and that's why I need to know what schools you'll be applying to. That's so I can gather the essay questions and group them into topics. And in general, the applications have several questions in common, and not all of them have all of these issues. One is typically about challenges or obstacles you faced and how you overcame them, your successes and failures, and you'll need to show that you either understand the reason for your failure or have already taken steps to address it, what you're proudest of having accomplished, either in school or out of school, what personal values are important to you, whether or not you've had to fight for them or defy expectations, any special talents or abilities you possess, and that's part of how you fit into the community for the particular school. So you will need to have done your research into the school to know what makes it unique and why it's a good fit for you. Also, something that appears is anything unique in your background or experience that makes you who you are, what you're passionate about, sort of where you get lost in time, what are you grateful for? Is there someone or something who had a major influence in your life, good or bad? And of course, your goals. In the time we have, we'll talk through those questions based on what I've learned about you through FAME and our conversation with each other, and how to address those questions. So the more effort you put into FAME, the more time we'll have to discuss how to answer specific essay questions and how to structure your essays. If I have a lot of information in advance, what you'll have at by the end of our interview is a structure or an outline for each essay. And usually once we go through the first or most difficult application, you're going to have the framework for the other applications as well. So you'll write your essay based on the structure and content we've discussed and on which you'll take notes. And then you'll send me a draft of each application, not each essay, but each full application set of essays. I'll make very specific comments on the contents that might need to be addressed or where you need to elaborate on an issue. And I'll work with you on the grammar, spelling, punctuation, and usage in a way that is consistent with your writing style. And of course, will be consistent with whether you use American English or British English. And I can help fill in the gaps with your own style. Then you'll revise your essays based on the feedback and send them back to me for review. And in general, it should take just those 2 rounds of review to get your essays ready to submit to Caitlin.
Brenna, that's really helpful. And that's actually a really good point, because after you finish with your essay coach at MBA Link, we have what we call the AD final review, the admissions director. And so I put my admissions hat back on and I will read all of the final applications. And so you will actually get feedback from me. And looking at everything like from a macro perspective, the bones of it are probably unchanged. I'm not going to come in and tell you need to change your entire theme, but it is helpful to have someone who has eyes on the entirety of what you're presenting to make sure that you are connecting those dots, as I mentioned earlier. Brenna, I have one question for you, just about, you mentioned the specific questions for each essay set. Can you talk about, because I know I get this question a lot from clients, how much they're able to repurpose their content? So like taking one essay and using it for like 3 or 4 different schools. And I know it depends on the school, but maybe your experience with like how many original essays you tend to work on with clients, and then how much of it is, adapting what they've already written so that they're not starting from scratch with every single application.
Right. Absolutely. For students applying to INSEAD in particular, I think that application covers absolutely everything. So if you're applying to INSEAD, we will go through those questions in detail, and most of those will be usable for another essay. But of course, you're going to orient it towards the specific school and to where you fit in with it. But once you have the framework, it'll be a lot easier to work on each subsequent application. And I think people are amazed by the time they work on their second application, how much easier it is than working on the first application, where we're working on the structure of your essays and how to tell your story. So yes, you're going to use a lot of the content that we will have developed for subsequent applications. But that's also why I want to be sure I know what all the questions are, so that we can discuss them and plan how to address them.
Right. And the other thing, one thing I just wanted to expand on that Brenna had mentioned is that by the time you get to the essay writing phase, you do have to confirm your schools, because obviously we want to make sure that we're helping you with answer the questions that are being posed. But up until that point, you're going to be going through the research process through FAME, where you're exploring your fit. And so sometimes people say to me, well, do I need to know my schools right now? Absolutely not. By the time you start with essays, and that's why it comes later on in the process, you will need to have a clear idea about that. And then the last thing I just want to mention before we move on is that because of the way our coaching framework is created, you can do the coaching for 1 or 2 schools, and then you can take that and actually apply to the other schools on your own. So some clients will say, look, I'm on a budget. We get that. I want to do 1 or 2, maybe 3 schools with MBA Link, and then I'm going to do 2 or 3 on my own. And so we can help you figure out, all right, well, if these essay sets are very similar, then maybe you choose to do 1 with MBA Link, and then you can use all of that to apply to the other school's application that you then complete on your own. And in that way, you're able to extend the value of the services that you're getting. And that's really helpful, because we know it's a huge investment that you're making, obviously, for your MBA, but even the coaching and the consultation services. So that's just an added benefit to the way that we structure the coaching process. All right, I'll keep moving along, Brenna. I'm sorry, my Zoom is getting a little stuck here. Oops. There we go.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, let me open this up, because I can see it better. Yeah. So in terms of the don'ts, you don't want to brag. You describe, and that allows the reader to draw their own conclusions. You don't list absolutely everything you've done. You're going to choose a few highlights. And for any red flags, you do not ignore them. You explain them in a neutral way, neutral but factual. So what I need from you, as we've discussed, is to take the FAME process seriously, confirm the schools that you're applying to, and ask me if there's something you don't understand or agree with. And what I always do after talking through the framework for answering a question and throughout the process is I want to make sure that I'm understanding things correctly and that you're comfortable with the approach to answering it, because it's not my application, it's your application. So I will repeatedly ask, does that make sense to you? Does that sound right with how you want to present yourself? And if it isn't, we'll go through another discussion and figure out the right way to address it.
Yeah. And Brenna, I'm wondering if you can speak to, and this goes back to something we were talking about before, but how you help clients align their essay with the specific school to show interest. And this is important from an institutional perspective because schools want to admit people that want to be there. Right. We used to have a category called yieldability. Right. And so if a school extends an offer, how do we know that the person is going to have a high likelihood of accepting? Right. And so that's something that you want to be able to, again, proactively be able to communicate through your essay. Now, what you don't want to say is, oh, well, this is my top choice and this is my dream school and the place I've always been. You don't want to, I've always wanted to be. You don't want to write that for all 7 of your schools. But I'm wondering, Brenna, how you help people demonstrate interest and make sure that they're not just sending the same essay off to 7 different schools, which is the other extreme of what you don't want to do.
Right. And that's where your research into the schools and the fit part of FAME are very appropriate. I'll give you an example from a different part of my experience. I worked with a young man on undergraduate applications. And when it came time to actually accepting the school, one of the things he said, which was absolutely perfect for the essay, was the reason he accepted Princeton is because it did not have a graduate school. So, well, it has some graduate programs, but the majority of the focus was undergraduate. And that meant he felt he would get more attention from individual professors on his interests because they didn't have to split their time with graduate students. So you want to show an understanding of the school that demonstrates you've really looked into each school thoroughly. Hopefully you've visited it, or you've been getting email from them for a long time. You've spoken to somebody at the school, previous graduates. So you want to demonstrate that you understand the school well and can show why it is the perfect fit for you. So you sort of need to emotionally change hats for each school. You'll need to say, this school is the perfect fit for me for this particular reason that is unique to that school. And when you move on to the next essay, think about why that school would be perfect for you by explaining what makes it a perfect fit for you. And that includes discussing certain professors and classes, but not just naming them, but actually showing why that would be a perfect fit for you. And that will give the school an indication that you are likely to accept them if they accept you.
And then one other thing I wanted to ask about, just along the lines of choosing a few highlights, can you maybe speak, Brenna, to this very sometimes delicate balance between being professional and also being personal? And that is to say, stories that you may want to share that you need to think about maybe the level of appropriateness. Maybe you have an example of where you had to, think about and coach someone, whether it was to be more personal or maybe to kind of pull back and not, have their essay read like a diary entry. I don't know, I'm putting you on the spot and I'll give you a second to think about it. Because I worked with a client who wanted to share just some really personal information about a situation that he had as an undergrad that really influenced his academics. And it was a little tricky. It also, without sharing too much, it dealt with some pretty controversial political topics. And so, I was really challenged to help him figure out, how do I talk about this, but be very clear about why he felt like it was important to talk about? Because you do have to remember who your audience is, and you don't necessarily know who that is. So I'm not suggesting that you should not write about certain things because you don't want to offend, but it is important to keep those things in mind, especially in such a politically charged environment that we're living in, especially over the past year as we've been dealing, especially in the US, but certainly worldwide with the pandemic, but some of the political issues that people are dealing with. It's something to consider as you're thinking about what to share. And like I say, I was thinking about this client who wanted to share something very deeply personal. And I really had to challenge him to think about, what is your strategy behind sharing that? Because you need to be very clear. On the other side, sometimes I'd be reading applications and I was like, oh my goodness, I feel like I'm reading like this person's deepest, darkest secret. That's not the goal. That's not what they're looking for. There needs to be a clear, again, I keep using this term, but this clear through line of what you're saying and why you're choosing to share it. So I don't know, Brenna, if you've been challenged or have an example off the top of your head where someone maybe either overshared or was undersharing, and how you help them sort of strike that balance a little bit more.
Yeah, the one thing that really comes to mind, and again, this was an undergraduate application, was a girl who wrote about being raped by her uncle. And yeah, I was very concerned about her writing about that, but it was a pivotal experience that did shape who she was. What I suggest is that if you have a sensitive topic to address, you need to first remove the emotion from it. You talk about things objectively, sort of looking at the experience a bit from a distance. And again, focusing on how it affected you and what you learned from it, how you changed from it. So I don't have a political example to share, but I would focus on the values that are important to you rather than why things need to be one way or the other. That's how I would approach it. And yes, each situation is going to be a completely unique one that we're going to have to evaluate. And maybe Caitlin and I will talk about what would be an appropriate way to address something that's very tricky. So we take those situations very seriously and put a lot of thought behind how will that play with an admissions committee. We don't want to make them uncomfortable, but we want them to understand who you are and why a certain situation or experience was very meaningful in terms of how it changed you.
Yeah. And one thing Brenna just mentioned that is important, that's very MBA Link specific, is that we use a team approach partially for that reason, so that you have several different expert opinions and eyes on your application, so that you have all of that feedback. And then you can decide for yourself what resonates, what feels right. Our coaching team, we talk to one another a lot. You'll be working with a couple of different coaches. And so Brenna and I'll sometimes, reach out to her and say, hey, what was going on here with this part of the process? Or what did you think? So we actually communicate and then we'll deliver messaging so that it's consistent and so that it's as constructive as possible. And it's nice to know through this process that you do have a team behind you, that it's not just one person who's giving you their opinion, but rather several different people who are drawing on their experiences to give you as sort of well-rounded, multidimensional of a perspective as possible. So let me just keep going. So I started asking some questions just because, Brenna, as you were talking, it was reminding me of a few things. But I do want to see, what are some questions that you all have? If you want to unmute yourself to ask the question, you certainly can. If you want to put something in the chat, I have the chat box up. And I can take your question that way. But if it's something we've talked about that you want some clarity on, maybe there's something we didn't talk about that you were wondering about, this is sort of a safe space where you can ask those questions, and we'll be brutally honest as we try to be, again, in a constructive way throughout the process. But is there anything that you were wondering about related to content of the narrative or the process around creating and communicating that narrative? Excuse me. We have a quiet group here.
It's a lot to absorb.
It is, and especially because you've been through this process as an undergrad. And Brenna, you talked about some of the undergrads that you work with. I also work with undergrads as well. And it is a very different process because obviously an 18-year-old and the way that they're thinking and their perspective and insight is notably different than someone who is several years usually out of undergrad, who is a professional, who is going back to school with probably a whole different set of goals than when you went to undergrad. So although you've been through the process, and I wrote a blog post about this recently, so you can see it on our website, but if you were the type that was able to like just do all your college applications like the night before they were due, that's awesome. That's great if that worked for you. I would strongly recommend that you don't try that for business school, because the process for business school, the application process, it's not meant to be onerous, but it is meant to force you to really think if you're producing something that's going to be compelling. So staying up the night before, and look at, are there MBAs who do that? Probably, of course. But to really start the process in a way that, you know, is going to be most valuable, is to try not to cut corners doing it. And so I would just encourage you, as you're thinking about this MBA experience as the whole, going to business school, starting with the application process as a warm up for that.
And Myra has a question about that.
Yes.
And I think, yeah, Caitlin, you're best poised to address that.
So the question is there a maximum and minimum time before the deadline you'd need us to reach out to you? Great question. I mean, how much time does it take? The reality is that, like all things, the more time you have, the less stressful it's going to be, because you're not going to feel like you're racing against the clock. I will tell you that right around now is when we're launching with a lot of new clients in preparation for the round one deadlines. Most of the round one deadlines at the top US programs begin. HBS's, Harvard Business Schools, is usually the first. I don't think they've published officially, but last year it was September 4th. The one exception to that, I guess, would be Columbia, CBS, because they have a rolling admissions process. And they, excuse me, once they publish their application, or once it goes live, which is usually like mid-June, at that point you can actually start submitting. And their round one deadline, you can submit all the way until, last year, again, it was October 5th, I believe. And so I would say Columbia and Harvard tend to be the two soonest applications that you would need to prepare. But that said, because of how our comprehensive packaging, I mentioned, we've been talking a lot about FAME, that's really the starting process. The more time you have to move through that without having to rush, typically the better your product's going to be. So I would say reaching out now, and actually you can see on the slide, where do I even begin? You know, you can do a customized consultation with me. We offer them free. It's a free conversation where I can actually give you feedback just based on a couple of, you know, pieces of information. I'm not doing a full read. I can't give you, you know, the probability that you'll be admitted to a certain number of schools, but I can give you a really objective perspective, some things to think about. And so you can reach out to me via email. Also on our website, you can fill out the intake form that will come to me, and we can get that set up. And then figuring out what type of work you want to do with us. Our comprehensive packaging includes everything that we've talked about: FAME, resume, essays. We do video essay coaching. We do interview coaching. We do, you know, helping you negotiate offers, helping you appeal scholarships. I've been doing that with clients recently. And so that's like A to Z. And what I was saying about the comprehensive packaging, it's billed by the number of schools. So you would choose the number of schools. We also offer hourly packages, which is a great fit for some people. What I find, though, is that most clients end up rolling into a comprehensive because they realize, I actually thought I just needed you to review my essay, but now once we start digging in, they realize they need a little bit more help than that. So you can certainly, flexibility is really the name of the game. So if you start with us on one package and you want to, you know, transition, you can certainly do that. Typically, the comprehensive, again, offers a more complete service. It's usually financially in a client's best interest because there isn't a set number of hours in the same way. Now, that said, we do know generally how long you're going to spend on each of these phases. Brenna mentioned with the essays, we've been doing it long enough that we've got it down to a science so that we can use your time wisely to make sure that we're not starting the essay process over 4 times for one essay. That's just not going to be the best use of time. We've really tried to tighten up our process so that by the time you get to the, you know, copy edits, you're feeling really good about how your essay is shaping up. So again, the sooner the better. I've worked with some clients over the course of a year plus. And then I've also worked with some clients, Brenna, you and I, Lord help us, right around the deadlines. Yeah. They'll come to us, they're like, I've got like 4 weeks. And it's like, oh, okay. I hope you've got the bandwidth. As long as you've got the bandwidth, we will make it work in whatever timeline you are trying to meet. However, again, just do yourself a favor and try not to stress yourself out too much right before those deadlines. I
You
will
know,
say our coaching team. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Bryna.
sorry, I'm always concerned when, people need to submit everything to you for the ADL review, when, especially before the Christmas holidays, and people have a
Yes.
very firm deadline.
Yes.
And I tell them, Caitlin's going to have a lot of applications to review right at this time. You will be doing yourself a favor if you can get it in earlier rather than at the very last minute, because that's going to affect how much time and attention your application will receive.
Right. One of the other things that we do, though, is when you decide to engage with us, and we hope that you will, I will do a launch call with you and we will sit down and we will figure out, I will create a timeline with targets and deliverables. And so we know you're busy. We know that you don't necessarily have time to think about that. And so we will deliver that to you. You have to execute it, right? And I will send gentle reminders about like this upcoming target. Like you should be finishing up FAME right now. You should be getting started on your essays right now. You're about a week out from sending everything to me. And the goal is not to pester you, but to make sure that you have enough time to implement a lot of this valuable feedback that you're getting. Because there's nothing worse than, someone sends me their application and, they've got 24 hours before they have to submit it. And I feel like, are they going to be able to implement all of this feedback? So we will create a plan so that that doesn't happen. But it is obviously up to you to deliver on the plan, like all things. So that's a really good question. I'm glad you asked that, Myra, about timing. Other questions that people have about the logistics, the process, content. Just to go back, I was talking about the consultation that you could do. And then at that point, figuring out what is going to work best for you in terms of the number of schools. Some people will say, I'm going to start off with 1 school or 2 schools, and then they might add on. You can certainly do that. The other thing I like to emphasize is that the work you do for FAME and resume, that will apply to any of your schools, no matter what. So some people will say, look, I can only afford to do 1 school. That's totally fine. If you, let's say, get an interview from a school that you didn't officially complete with us, that's okay. You can use your interview services for that school. The idea is we do this because we are invested in your success, right? So whether you officially completed an application with us or not, we feel like the work that we've done with you has contributed to your success. So we want to, see that through just as you do. We have the same goals as you. And so again, that idea of flexibility and being able to deliver whatever services you're going to need. I do a lot of creative packaging with people. So we may do like a comprehensive and then we'll add on some hours and we'll target the hours in this way or that way. We can, do our best to work with you depending on your situation.
And I see Henry has a very good question in terms of how long an essay should be. Most of the essays have a guidance, that tells you this should be 250 words maximum or X number of characters. Harvard's essay does not have a limit in terms of length. It's a challenging one, but a really good one. So for Harvard, it should be the length that it takes to tell the complete story of who you are and why you're applying there. But we keep it very concise. I don't think any of them have ever gone over, 1,000 words. And usually, yeah, it's about 750 words. But your comment about rather than sending one essay in one go, is it possible to write multiple short ones? Yes, and that's why I request that when you send me your essays, it be for one entire school, all of the essays for one school, because that's exactly what I will look at, making sure you're not repeating things in certain responses, that you're giving unique information with each essay, and yes, so that they all work together as a comprehensive story. That's a very good question, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to elaborate on that.
And just to piggyback on that, you'll have your formal essays that Brenna would work with you on. And then you also sometimes have short answers, which aren't essays, but in the actual application form. And I would review that through the course of the AD final review. A lot of people, I think they just think of the application as like a form with biographical information. And certainly it's a lot of that. There's a lot of opportunity there to be strategic about what you're including to supplement your essays and to certainly make sure there's consistency. So those short answers, that's especially true with INSEAD. That's why looking at everything like from a macro perspective, Brenna likes to make sure that there's no, repeating through your essay set. And then I like to make sure that it complements or supplements rather, whatever it is that you've written in your essays on your actual application form. So we will make sure that all of that comes together nicely. Any other questions? I'm trying to think, Brenna, if there's anything else. Most of the big questions that I get from clients, I think I've asked you at this point. But just want to make sure that, people feel like, here are a couple of takeaways that I'll give you real easy that you can do on your own, whether you choose to engage with a consultant and with MBA Link. The first, this sounds so obvious, is to proofread your essays. But when I say proofread your essays, it's not just grammar and spelling. That's kind of a given, right? But it's also making sure that if you are repurposing your content, that you're making sure to shuffle out the school name. It sounds silly, but you would be amazed. I think at least a couple times a season, I see someone who's writing about, Hanover, New Hampshire. And I just loved my campus visit there. And I can't wait to get to Columbia. And so clearly, a reader would understand. And look, at the AdCom knows that you're using essays for different schools, so that's okay. But that's an important attention to detail, right? And that's part of what they're looking at. So make sure that your search and replace function is working. The other thing, so that's the first big thing. The other thing that I think is a helpful exercise is once you've gone through the essay process or whatever point you feel comfortable to give your essay to somebody sort of outside of the MBA world, someone who knows you, a trusted friend, maybe a family member who can read it and then give you the feedback. Does this sound like you? Does it sound like this is in your voice? And importantly, don't tell them what the question is, and then see if after the fact, they can repeat back to you what they think the question was. And that's important because a lot of these schools are asking the questions for very specific reasons. And so you want to make sure first and foremost that you are answering the question. I've read so many fantastic essays where I'm like, this is really good, but this isn't what they're asking. And that's important. Again, this sounds very obvious, but I'm telling you this from years of experience of reading great essays that didn't answer the question, or reading, maybe an essay that doesn't really sound like you. And really someone who knows you well can give you that feedback. Obviously your coach can help you with that, but someone who knows you a lot better can also give that to you. So those are my two major takeaways. Make sure your find and replace works in all of your proofreading. And secondly, making sure that you're answering the question very directly. It looks like we have another question. Do you want to, I'm just reading it now. Okay. So this is a question. Is there any incident in which the story portrayed in an essay doesn't match with what the letter of recommendation tells? Sometimes what we think we are is different from what other people think we are. This is a great question, Henry. I don't know, Brenna, if you have a take on this or if you want me to take a first stab while you're thinking about it.
Well, I don't usually see the letters of recommendation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So a couple of things, Henry, that I would note. One is that the recommendation is supposed to be just that. It's supposed to be a third person perspective on you. And so if it's not consistent with what you're writing, first of all, you may not know that depending on your relationship with your recommender. But the goal is to show self-awareness. Most of the recommendations, and I do a whole strategy session with clients on recommenders, selecting your recommenders. How do I prepare my recommender without actually writing the letter, which some recommenders will tell you to do. And I strongly, strongly recommend that you do not, because in most cases, you're signing an ethos statement that says you haven't done that. You'd be surprised how much more obvious it is when that's been done. Now, that said, even though you're not writing the letter for them, you can certainly give them input. You could give them examples of things that they might be able to talk about. I often say that, going back to a performance review, if they've written you a performance review, so that they're not starting from scratch with having to generate examples of all these different, achievements that you've had, for example, or, management situations that you've been involved in for better or for worse. But I would say that generally speaking, there is consistency. And if there's not, that's okay too, because part of the goal of that part of that component of the application is to get a more objective perspective. I will tell you from a reader's perspective, I almost always read applications in the same order. I would look at the academics first to see, like, is this person an academic risk? Do we have any questions there? It didn't mean that it was, they went to the no pile, if not, but it would just help me understand, okay, where are we academically? And then I would go through, read the application, read the essays. I would, usually wait and read the recommendations and the interview reports last. And I did that to see if it gelled with what the picture was that I was already creating in my mind based on what the person had presented. More times than not, there was a lot of consistency. If it totally was inconsistent, then I would sort of pause. I would go back and think, huh, am I missing something here? In some cases, we would go back to an interviewer. We would go back to a recommender and maybe ask some follow-up questions. It would depend on what the inconsistency was. But generally speaking, that wasn't a major pitfall that I found people would fall into. Interviews sometimes too, if I found that, wow, this person showed up for a half hour in this interview totally differently than they did on their application. And sometimes that was for better and sometimes for worse. I'll never forget the applicant I had who was absolutely amazing on paper. Really impressive. The interview at that point I thought was going to just be okay, yeah, let's just kind of check here. He's good. He showed up for the interview. And what I later discovered is that he has a lot of sort of social issues and disabilities that did not come through on his application. And so that ended up being the reason that ultimately he wasn't admitted. So even though he looked absolutely unbelievable on paper, I use the interview as an example. I'm trying to think. I don't think the recommendation is as impactful negatively. Usually I would go back to the recommender. But my point is that it's usually in extreme cases where there's an inconsistency. And so to some degree, you can only control that so much. But I would say that the conversations and the preparation that you do with your recommender is one way to try to avoid that. And so I do more coaching around how to do that. I know I kind of over answered that question, but hopefully I gave you several things to think about as you're contemplating that. And I will tell you, there have only been a handful of times that a recommendation has absolutely been like red flags, like, oh my goodness. A recommender wrote about how a particular candidate had a very difficult time managing his temper. And he gave an example of a time when the candidate was slamming his hands on the desk in the middle of a meeting, and the recommender had to tell him to excuse himself. And we thought, woo, okay, that's pretty bad if the recommender in a recommendation is feeling like this is important enough to tell the admissions committee. So that was probably one of the few memorable situations where I felt like, wow. And the fact that the candidate didn't remember that and think about talking about that with the recommender, that he chose someone who he had this issue with, that just was sort of red flags for us. That made us very concerned that this is someone who can't manage their emotions. And, so we had a whole conversation about that. But that's a memorable one. Okay, at this point, we are at time, and I do want to be mindful of time. Want to thank you all for joining us. Both my email and Brenna's email is right here. Also want to direct you to some client testimonials that we have from this past cycle, so that you can see what their experiences were like working with MBA Link, but many of them talk about their essay process just because that was a major focus for them. And one of the main reasons why they decided to engage with MBA Link. Also want to send a special thanks to Bryna, who is based in California. So she's actually up in 6 a.m. wake up call for this. And I really appreciate her doing that, sharing her experience. She's one of our best, like I say, a fan favorite essay coach on the team. So hopefully you'll have an opportunity to get to know her a little bit better and benefit from all of her expertise. But in the meantime, we hope you'll reach out to us. We wish you luck through the process and hope that we'll get to work with and meet some of you hopefully soon.